All right, well, I think by my watch it's 2:20, and well, there isn't a clock in here. Oh, there is. Wow, it's the same time, because most of the clocks in this school are not on the same time, if you haven't noticed yet. I've noticed because I work here. Maybe we should fix that. It wouldn't be that hard. I guess it would make things less exciting. So we'll go ahead and get started. The name of my paper is On Taking Students Seriously. Wow, a lot of reverb in this room.
Is there just one page?
There is just one page. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for handing those out as well. So the name of my paper is On Taking Students Seriously. I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Trent Demarest. I work here. I am the Dean of Academics and the 7th and 8th grade teacher. I know what one of those things is. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed all the interesting and exciting use of visuals and things. I'm just going to read you a paper. So thank you for coming to my talk. I'd like to open with some words from a favorite poet of mine, a favorite poem from The Buried Life by Matthew Arnold, a great Victorian poet. Light flows our war of mocking words, and yet, behold, with tears mine eyes are wet. I feel a nameless sadness o'er me roll. Yes, yes, we know that we can jest. We know that we can smile. But there's a something in this breast to which thy light words bring no rest, and thy gay smiles no anodyne. Give me thy hand, and hush a while, and turn those limpid eyes on mine, and let me read there, love, thy inmost soul. I must apologize in advance for the conspicuous absence of the term truth from the title of my paper. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that I wrote this paper a while ago and submitted it to Pastor Kane back in February, before I had looked at the conference theme. It passed muster with him and the CCLE board, so they must have determined that what I wrote was germane enough to a pedagogy of truth to be presented. So here's hoping. The title of my paper, On Taking Students Seriously, is directly inspired by C.S. Lewis's well-known essay, The Weight of Glory, which comprises chapter 1 of his book by the same title. Specifically, I have chosen to use some lines from the final paragraph of the essay, which could in more ways than one be termed its ultimate paragraph, as a sort of heuristic frame for my comments today. It seems most fitting and only fair that I should begin my talk by reading the relevant excerpt, which you all have in front of you, so that you all will get to hear at least some real eloquence during this next hour. It's a longish paragraph, so sit tight, and you can follow along like Lutherans and bulletins. It works. Starting in medias res. Meanwhile, the cross comes before the crown, and tomorrow is a Monday morning. A cleft has opened in the pitiless walls of the world, and we are invited to follow our great captain inside. The following him is, of course, the essential point. That being so, it may be asked what practical use there is in the speculations which I have been indulging. I can think of at least one such use. It may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load, the weight, or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are in some degree helping each other to one or the other of these destinations. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play. But our merriment must be of that kind, and is, in fact, the merriest kind, which exists between people who have from the outset taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way. For in him also Christ, vere latitat, the glorifier and the glorified, glory himself, is truly hidden. So far, Lewis. There's something quite wonderful in this phrase, the pitiless walls of the world. It richly suggests two ideas, both very Christian, I think. In the most obvious sense, it provides us with a martial image. Christ, the victor over sin, death, and hell, has conquered the world, not to destroy it, but to rule over it in perfect love and justice, that is to say, in perfect righteousness. He has breached its walls. The world is his, and because it is his, it is ours. He calls us into it to be salt and light, to cultivate it, to partake of its blessings, and to exercise true dominion over it through the estates which God has ordained, as has always been our charge from the beginning of time. In Christ, the second Adam, to whom all authority in heaven and on earth has been given, the orders of creation are reiterated, reaffirmed, and recapitulated. There is, however, a second and more subtle image suggested by this phrase. I'll read it again. A cleft has opened in the pitiless walls of the world, and we are invited to follow our great captain inside. We hear echoes of Lewis's oft reiterated contention that although heaven, that is the kingdom of God, is by no means some Gnostic negation of this world, it is at the same time other. It is not non or anti-worldly, but nor is it this world in its mereness. Heaven is at right angles to this earthly plane, infinitely near. In the pursuit of godly knowledge, through the ordinate use of our reason, we see through to the meaning of things. To use Plato's terminology, we contemplate their form. The exterior of the world might look like a pitiless wall, repulsive to reason and sense. Think of the portrayal of nature found in Hobbes or Darwin or even London. But we who are wise, who have the mind of Christ, can see that there is order and harmony. Indeed, that sin has been unable utterly to efface goodness, truth, and beauty from God's handiwork. In all of this, Lewis articulates some very high stakes for our earthly work as Christians, and by extension for our work as Lutheran school teachers. The neighbors whom we serve, the weight of whose glory is in some sense laid upon our backs, are our students. Our students are the immortals to whom Lewis refers, the potential gods and goddesses. We need not think that he is a crypto-Mormon for this turn of phrase. He employs these terms poetically and not literally, and we shouldn't get hung up on that. A more substantive critique might be leveled at this suggestion. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or the other of these destinations, namely heaven or hell. Is that true? It seems like Lewis might be falling into what the Reverend Heath R. Curtis has termed functional Arminianism, which he, that is Curtis, defines as multiplying the possible causal agents of salvation beyond one, namely God. I don't know. Perhaps Lewis is wrong here. He wasn't a Lutheran, and in places his theology certainly departs from ours. On the other hand, Lewis may simply have been imprecise in giving voice to an apparent scriptural paradox. No one can snatch Christ's little ones out of his hand, John 10. And yet whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in Christ to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. Matthew 18. Stumbling and offenses here refer to things which have the potential to cause one of Christ's little ones to doubt or even lose the faith. Certainly no one would comfort himself with the thought, no matter what lies I tell these gullible children, their faith will be unharmed. No Christian would think that. More generally construed, then, Lewis's claim seems to be that the work of our various vocations is consequential, redounding to the good or harm of souls. For those whose vocations entail much speaking, certainly both pastors and school teachers fit such a description, the words of our Lord in Matthew 12 are sobering. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn, Lewis says. We must play. I have to believe that Lewis, ever the subtly elusive student of Plato, has in mind here the notion of serious play. Play not in the sense of idle frivolity or diversion, but play as the very enactment of life, the participation in things for their own sake, as ends not as means. What Lewis says next certainly lends itself to this understanding. And I quote, "But our merriment must be of that kind, and it is, in fact, the merriest kind, which exists between people who have, from the outset, taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins, in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence, which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment." End quote. If we were to set for ourselves the somewhat abstract task of enumerating or describing the necessary conditions of education, what would we say they were? As Lutheran school teachers, we might start with the brass tacks of our parochial school tradition, or maybe not. Perhaps we would list those things from the back of the report card, things like diligence, efficiency, timeliness, thoroughness, neatness, and organization. As classical educators, we would know better than to stop there, and maybe know better than to start there. However, we might go on to list such qualities as willingness to learn, honor for authority, reverence. Some rendition of the classical and theological virtues would not be without warrant. I wonder, though, whether we might be justified in considering one quality as fundamental to all those which have been listed, namely seriousness. This seriousness, literally taking each other seriously, is the basis for true merriment. It is the basis for serious play, which we, because we are classical educators, know as one of our favorite buzzwords, paideia. The word serious, like all words worth knowing, comes from Latin. Specifically, it derives from the classical Latin serius, spelled the same as serious but without the O, via the medieval Latin seriosus, via the French sérieux. Google will quite unhelpfully inform you that all of these words mean serious. But it also says earnest, and that, I think, is actually helpful, although for me, it immediately conjures up images of Ernest the turtle, the level-headed companion of the rash and overly trusting Adam Raccoon from the evangelical picture book series, The Adventures of Adam Raccoon, which I read as a child because I read the great books. And nobody else in the other session had heard of them either. It's okay. Man. Definitions only help us so much, though, leading as they do, if we let them, to an infinite regression into the dictionary. A word, defining a word, and so on. If none of these words ever conjures up an image in our minds, or to be more logically precise, a concept, they have done us little good. I, at least, have an anthropomorphic turtle in my mind right now. What have you got? In all likelihood, the word earnest brings to mind one of your students. This student approaches every subject as though there were something to be gained from it. He perceives a lack in himself. He knows that he does not know. That's a good thing. And he wants to change that state of affairs. Worries about grades may come and go, or maybe they never do. But he seems to think that what he's doing at and during school matters, not just what he gets after he's done doing it, a grade. School is for him the serious play, the paideia, to which Lewis alludes. It is just as fun, and probably even more fun, than recess. And this is precisely because he takes it so seriously. This student's seriousness, his earnestness, is not self-generated, nor is it maintained wholly by effort, as though it were a function of some continuous act of the will. Simply put, to him, the world, together with all of its strange inhabitants, is fundamentally interesting, and he doesn't quite know why. He is enthralled by it. The fact that God made all of it, well, that's more than interesting to him. The world, heaven and earth, all the works of God, these are wonderful. He knows this. Maybe not full well yet, but does any of us? It's important to recognize that such a student is not in a perpetual state of wonder, and if we're honest, we neither expect nor want such a state to be perpetual. No, but he is predisposed to wonder because he believes, and by such faith he knows that the world is wonderful. Thus he is ready for wonderment, and the readiness is all. We should keep in mind that seriousness is not a mood, nor even a temperament. Our serious student might be naturally cheery, or he may be more melancholic. He may be excitable and expressive, or he may be more subdued and contemplative. None of these in and of itself necessitates or precludes seriousness. Seriousness also is not synonymous with solemnity. Lewis rightly says that as Christians we are not perpetually solemn, and yet it would be wrong to think that seriousness never coincides with or entails solemnity. It most certainly does, at the proper times and places, which are probably more frequent and numerous than we moderns are wont to acknowledge. Now that our student has attained to the full stature of an archetype, let's give him a name. Ernest. Mind you, he is no turtle. As each of us knows, however, many of our students have yet to discover the importance of being earnest. Maybe you have Ernest on your roster. Maybe you don't. Maybe your students take turns being earnest. Maybe Ernest shows up for the first quarter, plays hooky for the middle two, and then gets rounded up by the truancy officer and reappears in the fourth. Maybe some weeks, some months, some years even, Ernest is not in your class. It would be a bit unrealistic and trite to pretend that Ernest is present on a day when he clearly is not. However, it is not idealism to be earnest yourself, regardless of whether your students are. Now, I don't think it's mere historicism or simple nostalgia to suggest that such earnest seriousness is a rarer and more elusive quality now than it has been in time past. The seriousness of the world and of education as a going concern has not changed, of course. How could it? For many reasons, though, this seriousness seems to have lost its purchase in our society. The objection may perhaps be raised, all seriousness and no joy, no fun? But this is to misunderstand what it means to be serious. If seriousness goes, so does joy. So too eventually does fun, and even all humor. More on this last point in a moment. Joy is not the opposite of seriousness. Joy is rather its concomitant, arising only from that which seriousness alone affords. For joy is the saved soul's perception of God in his works, which are the good, the true, and the beautiful. The eye of faith takes joy in the good creation of God, which it espies beneath the marring of sin, the good world which the fire of heaven will at the last trumpet purge and make new. Joy is the highest transfiguration of wonder. It is a deeply serious affair. Lewis says all of what I have attempted to express abstractly thus far in a better and more winsome way towards the end of the last battle, which I realize now that Dr. Kopf has already quoted in his excellent paper, and you're probably all familiar with it anyway. The Last Battle, of course, which is the final installation of the Chronicles of Narnia. And I quote, "Listen, Peter," said Lord Diggory. "When Aslan said you could never go back to Narnia, he meant the Narnia you were thinking of. But that was not the real Narnia. That had a beginning and an end. It was only a shadow or a copy of the real Narnia, which has always been here and always will be here. Just as our own world, England and all, is only a shadow or copy of something in Aslan's real world. You need not mourn over Narnia, Lucy. All of the old Narnia that mattered, all the dear creatures have been drawn into the real Narnia through the door. And of course it is different as a real thing is from a shadow, or as waking life is from a dream." His voice stirred everyone like a trumpet as he spoke these words, but when he added under his breath, "It's all in Plato, all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools?" The older ones laughed. It was so exactly like the sort of thing they had heard him say long ago in that other world where his beard was gray instead of golden. He knew why they were laughing and joined in the laugh himself. But very quickly, they all became grave again. For as you know, there is a kind of happiness and wonder that makes you serious. It is too good to waste on jokes. End quote. Wow, what an image. In every way, just wonderful. I'm telling you, folks, if you're not on the Christian Neoplatonist train with me, Clive Staples, and Dr. Kopf, you're just plain missing out. Plato, feature, not bug. Anyway, are not we, as classical Lutheran educators, trying to acquaint our students with precisely this kind of happiness and wonder that makes you serious, that is too good to waste on a joke? Yes, we are. Our students are already acquainted with the cheaper variety of happiness, which bottoms out at the merely fun. This happiness is much more common. It is not a bad thing per se, but it is lower. They don't need us to help them attain it. It may be a result or an incidental aspect to what we do, and that's well and good, but it is not, properly speaking, the end or goal of education any more than the provision of a daily snack break is. The happiness that makes one serious, this is the end of education. As Lewis's foregoing words from the Last Battle suggest, true happiness is inseparably paired with wonder, that placid yet awed gaze of the mind upon the real, the perception of the works of God. "Be still and know that I am God," the Holy Spirit says in the Psalms. This knowing in stillness is the greatest happiness, and on this side of heaven we know it only in part as a vision through a darkened glass. Such knowledge is a foretaste, a prolepsis, the first fruits or earnest of the beatific vision. Whatever it is not fun, not trite, not material for jokes. There is certainly a time and a place for humor, but for the teacher, that time is not whenever, and that place is not wherever. It is often said that humor is a good way to diffuse a serious or tense situation. That's true to experience for each one of us, I'm sure. But is seriousness, or even tension, always so unwelcome as to require diffusing? I would argue the contrary. When a natural hush comes over a group of students, there is no urgent need to lighten the mood. More likely than not, the mood reflects the fact that the limit of their knowledge has been reached. They are on the edge not only of their seats, but of the hitherto unknown. A joke might seem like a great way to make them comfortable, to assure them that everything being discussed is quite familiar, copacetic, and relatable. But none of that is true. A student who has never read Shakespeare, upon hearing the St. Crispin's Day speech of King Henry V for the first time, rightly feels awed and humbled. He has never thought about courage, about honor, about brotherhood, about mortality in this way before. He never has, and after 8th grade graduation, there is no guarantee that he ever will again. Yes, the room is silent after the final lines, but no, this is not an awkward silence. Away with this cynical postmodernist cliche and all such like, the silence might not last long, but let it linger just a bit. Make eye contact. Yes, it's more than likely that they'll each turn away and they'll soon be trading glances and smirks with their classmates so to comfort themselves. This is normal, but they tasted it. Be still and know the works of God. No, not by or of themselves are the works of men known as the works of God, but because of everything else that your students have learned from you, they'll detect the Christianity in Shakespeare. And sometimes a student will meet your gaze in that silence as you scan the room just for a moment, smile furtively, bob his head just a little bit, and say, "Wow." And that's enough. That's great. In many, if not most instances, to diffuse the seriousness of a situation is effectively to anesthetize one's students to the very occasion in which they might otherwise have learned something. And not just learned in the sense of memorized a fact or improved a skill. What is diffused at that point is the ignition of wonder. The proper follow-up to reading Henry V's St. Crispin's Day speech is not nervous laughter and a joke about how King Henry will at some point in the future say, "Hey bro," to the men who fought with him when he sees them on the street. I know none of you would do that anyway, but it's hyperbole. Or some such proletarian shibboleth like that. No. Such a transition would shatter the moment of poignant awe, which cannot but follow the declamation of such immortal lines. If you are demonstrably not moved by what you have just read, if you are not humbled, it is all but guaranteed that your students will not be either. The reflex of making fun of everything is regnant in our postmodern culture. Satire is not a new genre. Indeed, it's as old as the written alphabet, which means that it's about as old as mankind. But the withering snark, which is now so ubiquitous, unless you consciously eschew most contemporary media, is not satire. The satirist excoriated in order to bring his object down to the right size, punctured hubris for the sake of sanity, lambasted ridiculousness in order to point up dignity and propriety. Not so today. Today's cynical hucksters do not have objects or topics. They have targets. Mark well the obvious difference. In our era, there is no such thing as a right size to be brought down to, no such thing as sanity to return to, no such thing as dignity or propriety to reattain. Targets are for blowing up. Behind the putative humor of today's comics is nothing but a pit of jaded nihilism and the cult of ego. Have any of you watched or listened to Louis C.K.? He's a funny guy, I guess. More notably, though, he's just a miserable person. I think a lot of comics are, to be honest. He's a hateful, grotesquely withered, and just withering soul. He's extremely profane and obscene, but he often talks about being a single dad and his routines. So I guess that helps people to appreciate his shtick as the absurdist ramblings of an average guy, doing the best that he can to deal with the vicissitudes of modern life, which allows them to do the same vicariously, or something like that. I watched a few of his sketches back in the day, but I just can't anymore. To say that there is nothing of delight and wonder in CK's material, or in the rest of the dog's breakfast of bitter sludge and flippancy, which dominates the entertainment media, is to undersell understatement. Of course, one of the most enviable postmodern virtues these days, though not quite as enviable as not knowing your gender, is being funny. Everyone wants to be funny, and almost everyone, it seems, thinks of himself as being very funny. For various reasons, the humor threshold might indeed be getting lower, such that people can be said to have a sense of humor, since that more people can now be said to have a sense of humor. I suspect that this has much to do with an increasing level of transgenerational and cross-demographic participation in the hive mind of shared pop cultural knowledge via social media. Perhaps most notably via the world of so-called internet memes. The point remains, though, that all humor is premised upon the pointing up of irony. Without this, there is nothing to laugh about. It is precisely here where humor itself, at least in its postmodern iteration, is beginning to fail at achieving its telos, which is really pretty serious given how reliant postmodern Westerners are on ingesting comedy as a means of taking the edge off of their enemy and self-loathing. Also, it's genuinely sad. So, to reiterate, all humor is based on irony. What is irony? Let's clear the air on this, just so that the record shows that we are not among the great unwashed who abuse this word in the same manner that they torture the word literally, by attempting to communicate the opposite of what it actually means. That's not ironic, that's apropos. Anyway, that happens all the time. For my part, I have yet to find a more lithe and compact definition than the one furnished by Dr. Daniel Sundahl, one of my English professors at Hillsdale College. Did you have Sundahl? No. Is he still there? Okay.
No, he's retired now.
He is?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, well, I was wondering in the first session if he was still there. So, Dr. Daniel Sundahl, a wonderful man at Hillsdale College. To wit, this was his definition. It stuck with me. Irony is the contrast between reality and expectation. Perhaps the sequence, the contrast between expectation and reality is better. In any case, humor, for the longest time, has relied on a fairly optimistic and credulous metaphysic when it comes to getting the irony it needs to work with. Simply put, God made a good world, and the way of things in this world is good. That is, the way God has ordered his creation, granting, of course, that sin has corrupted his handiwork. In all comedy, then, this ordinary and orderly way of things is temporarily interrupted, suspended, or inverted. Certain apparent absurdities in the way of things are noted and explored. And yet, in the narrative told by the comedian, which we find to comport in some way with our knowledge and our experience of life, things do not come to naught, are not unraveled, and the world is still as it should be. This delights us. We smile, we laugh. We should note also that comedy as a literary genre isn't necessarily humorous. See Dante, the Commedia. Comedy is, however, necessarily cosmically affirming, which, although that sounds like something from a weird Hollywood cult, simply means that things come right in the end. That beloved and most well-known form of microcomedy, the joke, works by telescoping all the major elements of this sequence, thus heightening our perception of irony. The best jokes have the complete plot of a comedy, as it were, but in the space of a few seconds. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
2. To whom? In any case, if irony is the contrast between reality and expectation, but people no longer share a common credulous perception of reality or mess with your knock-knock jokes, then there can be no common enjoyment of irony. That's why we can't have nice things. Given that ours is an age of increasing solipsism, in which solipsists sort and group themselves according to their respective identities, it is not only possible, but practically inevitable that we will see more and more surfeit of discourse which meets the technical specifications of humor, yet which somehow fails to be funny. In a slight digression, it also seems inevitable that people will be unable to recognize the truly funny, will become incapable of genuine lightheartedness, and will find themselves triggered by the most benign of comments, necessitating the creation of ever more restrictive safe spaces until it's just myself alone. Why? My sense is that there still is a latent common perception of reality, to be sure. It cannot ever be completely done away with, after all. But this latent true perception is today resented with such a vengeance as false consciousness. Low-level millennial Marxists don't know much Marx, but they know that one. Those who do not hate many splendored reality, but instead look upon it with credulity and love, such people must repent or be destroyed. And that's all of us, for the record. That's my son, by the way, doing the backup vocals. Resentment, then, is the expected posture in the now regnant secular culture, especially among the college-aged youth. Those not yet poaching in full-on resentment might nonetheless be simmering in its earlier stages. Boredom, skepticism, and incredulity, and yes, to come back to Lewis at long last, flippancy. A corrosive, enervating, metaphysical flippancy. Not taking the world at all seriously. Not acknowledging that the way of things is good. But not necessarily thinking that it's bad either. Just thinking that it's lame, or stupid, or unimportant, or fit only for mockery. It is this latter condition, flippancy as opposed to resentment, that we are likely to encounter among some of our students, especially, but certainly not only, those who come from non-Christian or nominally Christian homes. But my point is this: if there is no common perception of reality, there can be no irony, for there can be no commonly perceived contrast between expectation and reality. Just as private languages can't exist, private jokes can't be funny. Unless, your 2-year-old tells them. This would explain, at least in part, why now we hear of such neoterisms as post-irony and the anti-joke. There, where you were waiting with a credulous smile for something unexpected, like the Green Lady of Perelandra, all eager to be delighted and to laugh. Here is nothing ironic whatsoever. The joke is on you. I, the teller of the joke, am laughing at you for expecting something typical, like some schmuck. How do you like them apples? Or maybe you and I are both so used to this cynical genre that we tell actual jokes in the old-fashioned way, but we tell the obvious punchlines so as to mock the very existence of punchlines as a category, and then we literally pretend to laugh. If one's default posture toward reality is that it is not worth taking seriously, only worth combating as a melange of oppressive forces, or mocking in a desultory fashion because everything is stupid, there is a bigger problem afoot for which the loss of funniness is but a symptom. Let me tell you a story that illustrates this. In another life, I worked as an after-school tutor for middle and high schoolers in the Washington, D.C. area. One afternoon, the particular student I was working with that day came walking up to the table with that slow, shambling gait characteristic of a tween trying to walk and watch YouTube at the same time. It's unmistakable. I'm sure you've all seen it. I didn't allow phones during tutoring sessions, and she knew this, so I told her to put it away. She looked up, still laughing. Okay, but you've got to see this first. I'm not interested, I said. Then my curiosity got the better of me. I guess I felt like I needed to take a sounding, get an idea of what kids were watching these days. Okay, what is it? I said. Well, I'll do my best to summarize. It looked just like the scene from the end of the movie The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy is saying that she's homesick. Glinda the Good tells Dorothy, "You don't need to be helped any longer. You've always had the power to go back to Kansas. Close your eyes and tap your heels together 3 times, and think to yourself, there's no place like home." Of course, in the movie, there's dialogue in the middle of that, but in this little clip, they had that whole line from Glinda all together, just like I read it. And after she says, "Close your eyes and tap your heels together 3 times, and think to yourself, there's no place like home," there's like a record scratch. And Dorothy says, "Seriously? What the?" Then there's some canned laughter, so you know what your response is supposed to be. "You mean I could have gone home this entire time?" More profanity, more canned laughter. My student, laughing rather stupidly, is there another way to describe a laugh which is wholly bereft of delight, put her phone away and noticed my pursed lips and furrowed brow. I didn't have a mustache, so it's easier to notice at that time. "Wasn't that funny? Ha ha." The best description I can give for what I felt is not anger, but sadness. Sadness and pity for this 12-year-old girl who knew nothing of the simple sweetness of this charming story. I thought about how my mother and her sisters loved this movie and just delighted in it when they were girls. I realized, and not solely as a result of her showing me this video, mind you, that this girl had more or less skipped childhood. Not because she was extraordinarily mature for her age, but because, for her age, she was extraordinarily lacking in innocence. This, I came to learn, was far more her misfortune than her fault. After all, she was just a kid. Now she is a young woman. God keep her wherever she is. Sadly, this is not all that exceptional. School is not the only acculturating force in our students' lives, and depending on their situation, it may not be the strongest. This is almost certainly true if students not only do not attend Orthodox Lutheran churches, but do not attend church at all. I don't say this to be defeatist. I say it to be realistic. There are significant reasons why we should not be surprised if our students are extremely unserious. And here I refer to reasons other than the fact that they are children, which by itself isn't a reason. These reasons have everything to do with the temper of the age in which we live, the character of the times, or if you'll pardon the whimsicality of the term, the zeitgeist. Call it what you will, our age is glutted with flippancy, presumption, superiority, mere tolerance, and indulgence, those dehumanizing or all too human vices which Lewis marks as inimical to seriousness. When we say that these vices characterize our age or our culture, in truth, I would rather call it an anti-culture, what do we mean? Do we intend to explain, to warn, to exonerate? Is this foul oversoul ubiquitous in our societal atmosphere, like a sickly miasma that we cannot help but breathe? Or is it more like a substance that we have in fact chosen to purchase and ingest? The question seems to be perennially vexing, and not just for us Lutherans. It is a variation on the theme of what does being in the world but not of it mean, look like, necessitate? I have not attempted to answer this rather large question in this paper. I will simply assert that we have a great amount of choice here. And in this matter and many others in this world under heaven, our wills are not bound. You cannot keep the birds from flying overhead, blessed Dr. Luther says, but you can keep them from nesting in your hair. Our students do not need our help developing their snarky senses of humor. If they don't have one yet, good. If they do, they probably need help in curtailing it more than anything. Our students need to know, above all, Christ and Him crucified. They need to know the Christian faith in all of its richness. They need to know the Holy Scriptures. I don't know how many of you caught Pastor Paul's talk, but the purpose of a liberal arts education in Luther's day was so that you could read the Bible and understand it. There's beauty in that simplicity. They need to know that God is the author of all that is good, true, and beautiful. And they need to be led to perceive, comprehend, and imitate those things which are good, true, and beautiful. Not because salvation is to be found in such knowledge or in such imitation. We are not Gnostics, nor are we synergists. But our students carry the treasure of faith in earthen vessels, as do we all. And from a human perspective, carrying this treasure is a fraught matter, especially in these evil days. Let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall. I'd like to close with a few more lines from Matthew Arnold's The Buried Life, which I also quoted at the beginning of my talk. It's too long to share in its entirety, but a really marvelous poem, which you should all read. But often in the world's most crowded streets, but often in the din of strife, there rises an unspeakable desire after the knowledge of our buried life. A thirst to spend our fire and restless force in tracking out our true original course. A longing to inquire into the mystery of this heart which beats so wild, so deep in us. To know whence our lives come and where they go. And many a man in his own breast then delves, but deep enough, alas, none ever minds. And we have been on many thousand lines, and we have shone on each spirit and power, but hardly have we for one little hour been on our own line, have we been ourselves. Hardly had skill to utter one of all the nameless feelings that course through our breast, but they course on forever unexpressed. And long we try in vain to speak and act our hidden self, and what we say and do is eloquent, is well, but 'tis not true. Let us not be untrue in our speech to our students. Obviously, we are not lying to them in the sense of telling them falsehoods, but let us not lie to them by modeling a merely street-smart eloquence, which can only traffic in irony, sarcasm, and insincere deflection. Let us take each other seriously. Thank you.